They say you should never mix family and business, but in my family, business is the only thing that matters. My name is Victoria Scott, and I was the good daughter, the soft one. I ran the charity wing of our family's real estate empire from a small brick building, while my father and brother ruled from their glass shark tank on the 42nd floor. Today, they summoned me to a meeting. A formality, my brother called it. They're about to vote to bulldoze my entire life's work, my grandmother's legacy. They think I'm just an emotional girl who will sit quietly in the corner. They're about to find out how wrong they are. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. My office doesn't have a skyline view, at least not the kind my father and brother value. I'm not on the 42nd floor in the glass and steel shark tank where they trade futures and gut portfolios. I'm downtown in a restored 1920s brick building, where my window looks out over the community garden we helped fund. You can still see the original rivet heads in the steel beams. My walls aren't covered in stock tickers or cold abstract art that screams power. They're covered in blueprints for the new Northside Youth Center and framed large-scale photos of the old textile mill we just finished converting into affordable lofts for local artists. This is the Scott Heritage Foundation, my small tolerated corner of the massive Scott Global Properties empire. I'm not naive. I know exactly what my father Harrison and my older brother Marcus think of me. I am Victoria Scott, the soft one, the company mascot. My foundation is the quaint side project, a rounding error in their budget, a PR expense they tolerate because community outreach looks good in the annual report. They run the real company, the part that chases nine-figure deals and tears down history to build gleaming, sterile towers. I run the part that preserves it, the part that remembers people. They don't understand that this isn't a hobby. It's my personal freedom. It's the firewall I've built between myself and the cold transactional world they thrive in. They value profit, I value resilience. They see buildings, I see homes. I just turned 30 last week. The day was quiet, which gave me too much time to think about my grandmother Alara. She died 2 years ago, and I still feel her absence like a missing stare in the dark. She was the only one who ever truly saw me. She'd visit me here in this office and run her hand along the rough brick, ignoring the dust. She'd smile, a real smile, not the tight corporate baring of teeth my father calls a greeting. "Sentiment has value, Victoria," she told me just before the end. Her voice was thin as paper, but her grip on my hand was steel. "Don't let them bleed it out of you." I've held on to those words like a shield. I was just staring at a new schematic for the youth center's gymnasium, trying to figure out how to pay for the hardwood flooring, when my assistant Sarah poked her head in. Her face was pale, which immediately set my nerves on edge. "Vicky, you've been summoned." I looked up, trying for a lightness I didn't feel. Summoned. What am I, a court wizard now? Sarah didn't smile. Her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. 42nd floor, Harrison and Marcus. I just got off the phone with your father's executive assistant. She said, and she stressed this, it's mandatory. The elevator doors opened onto the 42nd floor with a soft, expensive shang. The air up here is different, colder, thinner, smelling of industrial cleaner and faint, expensive cologne. The boardroom is a glass box, and the sunlight hitting the long, polished steel table was blinding. My father Harrison and my brother Marcus were already at the head of it, radiating a smug, predatory energy. They looked like they had just closed a kill. I took the seat farthest from them, the one always left for me, the kiddie table, as Marcus once called it. My father didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Victoria, glad you could make it." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We've got big news. Scott Global Properties is entering a new era. We've finalized a strategic merger with Dominion Holdings." My stomach clenched. Dominion Holdings. They weren't builders. They were butchers. A notoriously ruthless acquisitions firm known for hostile takeovers, mass layoffs, and liquidating assets down to the bare concrete. "It's a massive deal." Marcus jumped in, his voice vibrating with pride. He clicked a remote and the wall screen lit up. Dominion gives us the capital to finally streamline this company, cut the dead weight, and maximize shareholder value. He clicked again. A slide appeared titled Asset Optimization and Redevelopment, and under it, a bulleted list: Northside Youth Center, Rivertown Mill Lofts, the Alcott Block Restoration. My blood didn't just run cold, it froze. It was everything. All of my projects, my life's work, the communities I had spent years building. What? What does redevelopment mean? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Marcus glanced at me like I was a slow child. It means they're non-performing assets, Vicky. They're being liquidated to sweeten the deal. Bulldozed. We're getting a huge tax write-off and Dominion is putting up a high-rise. You can't... I whispered the words, getting stuck in my throat. I found my voice and it was shaking with a sudden hot rage. You can't do this. People live in the mill lofts. The youth center is the only safe place for those kids after school. You're destroying people's lives. Marcus actually laughed, a short, sharp barking sound. Oh, Vicky, it's just business. Don't be so emotional. You're thinking about a few tenants. We're thinking about $1 billion valuation. I looked at my father, pleading, Dad, please. Harrison held up a hand, silencing me. His expression was flat bored. It's for the greater good of the company, Victoria. It's done. The finality of it hit me like a physical blow. I was numb. I stood up my chair, scraping loudly in the sudden silence. I didn't say another word, just turned and walked out. I could feel their eyes on my back dismissing me. I stepped into the elevator alone and leaned against the cool glass wall as the door slid silently closed. My hands were shaking. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I fumbled for it, pulling it out. A text message. It was from Ben Carter, our longtime CFO, the only man in the company my grandmother had truly trusted. They just activated the clause. We need to talk. Now. Not here. The diner was called The Crossroads, a 24-hour joint off the highway that smelled of stale coffee and industrial-strength bleach. It was the last place on earth anyone from Scott Global would look for me. Ben Carter was in the back booth exactly as he said he'd be. His graying hair was damp from the rain, and his suit jacket was hung neatly on the hook. In front of him on the sticky Formica table was a thick accordion-style legal folder. It looked ancient, the cardboard soft at the edges bound with a faded red ribbon. I slid into the booth, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought he could see it through my shirt. Ben, what's happening? What clause? I didn't understand your text. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me. His eyes, usually so full of dry humor and spreadsheet calculations, were heavy sad. Happy 30th, Vicky, he said quietly. My birthday was last week, I said, my voice trembling with confusion. Ben, you're scaring me. It's the day you came of age, he said, tapping the folder. Your grandmother, Alara, she wasn't just a sweet old lady who liked gardening, Vicky. She was a chess player, a grandmaster, and she's been waiting for this move for 15 years. I stared at the folder, then at him. Ben, I don't. He slid the folder across the table. It was heavy. This, he said, is the Alara Scott Trust. Your grandmother loved your father, but she wasn't blind. She saw what he was becoming. She saw the greed in him, and she saw it magnified in Marcus. He leaned in, his voice, dropping, forcing me to lean in too, cocooning us in the booth's vinyl bubble. She knew one day they would try to gut the company's soul for profit. That's what she called it. Selling the foundations for scrap. My hand was shaking as I fumbled with the ribbon. I untied it and opened the folder. The top page was dense legalese, a wall of text. But I saw my name. I saw Alara's. And I saw a number. She put her entire controlling stake, 58% of Scott Global Properties, into this trust. Ben said, his voice flat, factual, like he was reading a balance sheet. It had 2 vesting conditions. The first was your 30th birthday, which just passed. The second, the early activation clause, was the initiation of any merger, sale, or acquisition that threatened the viability of the Heritage Foundation. By pushing the Dominion deal, Harrison and Marcus just triggered the early activation. The words didn't land. They just hung in the air, impossible and absurd. I looked up from the page, my vision swimming. What? What are you saying? Ben met my gaze. There was no ambiguity. I'm saying you own the company, Vicky, all of it. As of 10:17 a.m. this morning, when they filed the merger intent with the board, you became the majority shareholder. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel powerful. I felt cold. A deep seismic cold that started in my stomach and spread outward, making my skin prickle. This wasn't a gift, it was a burden. It was the crushing, devastating weight of my grandmother's foresight. She knew her own son, my father, and her grandson, my brother, were so broken, so greedy, that she had to build this nuclear option into her will to stop them. The betrayal wasn't just what happened today in that boardroom. It wasn't just them laughing at me and agreeing to bulldoze my life's work. It was this: the realization that my grandmother died, knowing her family was poised to destroy everything she built. The betrayal was multi-generational. She knew, I whispered the words tasting like ash. All this time, she knew they'd do this. She hoped they wouldn't, Ben corrected gently. But she prepared for it. She saw you. She watched you building the Heritage Foundation from nothing with the scraps they threw you. She saw that you were the only one who had her values, the only one who cared about the why and not just the how much. I closed the folder. The clatter of plates from the kitchen seemed incredibly loud. A waitress came by and poured coffee into the thick mug in front of me. I hadn't even seen it. "Tell me," I said, my voice hoarse. "Tell me all of it." Ben took a long sip of his own coffee. "You have to understand," he began, "when Alara and your grandfather started this company in the 60s, it wasn't Scott Global Properties. It was Scott and Son Community Builders. Their first projects were post-war housing. They built the first integrated library in this county. They built communities. They used their own hands." "I know the company history, Ben." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You know the sanitized version. The version Harrison lets you read in the brochures. The real story is that after your grandfather died, your father wanted to expand. He wanted to go corporate, chase the big money. Alara fought him. She fought him every step of the way. She argued that profit was a byproduct of good work, not the goal. She said a company had a duty to the people it employed and the city it was built in. He didn't listen?" I said, the story clicking into place with sickening clarity. "He not only didn't listen, he actively marginalized her. He and his new board, the Sharks he'd brought in from New York and Chicago, started painting her as an emotional liability. She'd bring up the community impact of a deal, and they'd talk over her about Q3 projections. She'd argue for employee benefits, and they'd accuse her of being soft, of lacking a killer instinct. By the end, Vicky, by the end, your father was telling people she was getting senile, that her sentimentality was a danger to the company." I felt bile rise in my throat. He said that about his own mother. He did. Ben said, his eyes hard. He sidelined her, made her a chairwoman emeritus, a title with no power. He thought she'd just go quietly. He underestimated her, just like he underestimates you. He tapped the folder again. "So Alara stopped fighting him in the boardroom, and she started fighting him in her lawyer's office. She couldn't stop him from running the company, but she could damn well decide who owned it. She created the trust, and she made me a mid-level finance guy. She'd taken a liking to her secret executor. Me. She promoted me. She protected me. She knew Harrison would never see the bean counter as a threat. For the last 10 years of her life, I wasn't just the CFO. I was her agent. I've been managing this trust in total secrecy, waiting, watching you, reporting back to her on your progress. Every project you fought for, every budget you balanced, she knew. She was so proud of you, Vicky. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and angry. She built this company with her bare hands. Ben continued, his voice rough. She used to tell me she could still smell the sawdust and wet concrete. She despised what Harrison had turned it into. All that glass and steel built on leveraged debt and broken contracts. She said he'd sold the farm to build a casino. She put this plan in place, this long, patient, desperate game, because she believed in you. She said you were the only one who still had the builder's hands. I stared at the folder. My hands were still shaking, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from rage. A pure, focused, white-hot rage that burned away the shock. They're not just selling buildings, Ben, I said, and I was horrified to hear my own voice tremble. I stopped. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I pushed down the tremor, pushed down the sorrow, pushed down the little girl inside me who still wanted her father's approval and her brother's respect. That girl was a liability. When I spoke again, my voice was flat, cold, the voice of the 42nd floor. They are selling my life's work. They are selling those kids at the youth center. They are selling my grandmother's legacy to a pack of jackals, just to get a bigger paycheck. I met his eyes. The transition was complete. The vulnerability was gone, packed away. What do we need to do? A slow, grim smile spread across Ben's face. It was the first time I'd seen him smile all day. There you are, he murmured. I was wondering when you'd show up. He flipped to the back of the folder. Here's the plan. The official merger vote is scheduled for exactly 1 week from today. Harrison and Marcus are arrogant. They think they have the 42% they control, and they assume the Alara Trust, which they know exists, but think is just a passive investment vehicle, will be voted by the board. They're counting on their own votes to carry the motion. They don't know I'm the beneficiary, I stated. They don't know anyone is the beneficiary yet. They think the trust is just a pile of money, shielded for tax reasons. They've never once asked me for the charter documents. They just assumed. Their mistake, I said. Our advantage, he countered. We must let them believe they are winning. We have to let them walk into that boardroom next week, fat, happy, and confident. Meanwhile, you and I have to execute the trust transfer. Alara's legal team at Cromwell and Swain, the best trust lawyers in the state, is waiting for your call. They've had these documents ready for a decade. You have to go there, sign the papers, and legally take possession of the shares. It has to be done in total secrecy. No one can know. You must become the majority shareholder on paper before you walk into that meeting. I nodded, my mind already racing, calculating. The shock was gone, replaced by a terrifying, cold clarity. 1 week, I said. It's going to be the longest week of your life, Vicky. You have to go to work. You have to see them. You have to pretend to be the broken, emotional little girl they expect you to be. I picked up the heavy folder, the weight of it now feeling less like a burden and more like a weapon. I slid out of the booth. They think I'm the emotional one, I said, the words sharp as broken glass. They think I'm just a mascot. Good. I looked at Ben, and he saw the steel that Alara had been counting on. Let them. They'll never see me coming. That night, I drove to the oldest part of the city, to a building of gray stone and gas lamps. The brass plaque read, Cromwell and Swain LLP, Est down to 1889. This was my grandmother's law firm, a place of old money and even older secrets. Ben had called ahead. The lobby was dark, save for a single green-shaded lamp on the security desk. A silent man led me to a wood-paneled elevator which groaned its way to the penthouse. The senior partner, a man who looked as ancient and formidable as the building itself, was waiting for me. His name was Arthur Abernathy, and his eyes, magnified by thick glasses, seemed to see right through me. Ms. Scott, he said, his voice a dry rustle. We've been expecting you for a long time. His office was a library filled with the smell of old paper leather and pipe tobacco. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center, and on it was a stack of documents that was easily a foot high. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," Abernathy said, gesturing to the chair. "Meticulous, patient. She called this the long insurance, please." I sat. For the next 2 hours I did nothing but sign my name. Victoria Scott. Victoria Scott. Victoria Scott. Each signature felt heavier than the last. I signed the activation of the trust. I signed the transfer of shares. I signed proxies, resolutions, and letters of intent. I signed papers that made me the sole undisputed legal owner of 58% of Scott Global Properties. It wasn't joy I felt. It was a cold, terrifying electric weight. This was the armor. This was the weapon. This was the legal embodiment of my grandmother's righteous, patient rage. When I finally put the pen down, my hand was cramping. "It is done," Abernathy said. He stood, a rare, thin smile gracing his lips. "Legally, as of this moment, you are the company. Your father and brother are, for all intents and purposes, your employees." He handed me a single sealed manila envelope. "The original charter, your certified share certificate, and my direct line. Do not, under any circumstances, lose these. Go give 'em hell, child." Elara would have expected nothing less. I couldn't just hide for the next 6 days stewing in my newfound power. I had to live in the lie. The next day I went back to my real office, back to the Heritage Wing. I had to face the people I was fighting for. I walked through the Rivertown Mill lofts, and Maria Rodriguez, a painter in 3B, stopped me in the hall. "Vicky," she said, her hands stained with turquoise paint, her eyes wide with fear. "My neighbor said he saw men in suits walking the grounds measuring things. He said he heard them talking about demolition. Is that true?" I had to look this woman whose rent I subsidized, whose work I championed, in the face and lie. I had to give her a weak, reassuring smile. "I've heard the rumors, Maria. I'm looking into it. Don't worry, I will do everything I can." The words felt like acid. It was worse at the youth center. Jamal, the teen director I'd hired right out of college, pulled me aside. "They're trying to take this place, aren't they?" he asked, his voice low. "The kids are scared. They think you're going to let your family bulldoze it." "I would never let them, Jamal," I said, and at least that part was true. "You have to trust me. Just give me a few more days." His eyes searched mine, and he must have seen the desperation there because he nodded slowly. "All right, Vicky. We're trusting you." That night I didn't sleep. The weight of their trust was heavier than the 58%. This wasn't about revenge anymore, not really. This wasn't about money or a corner office. It was about Maria. It was about Jamal. It was about the kids who had nowhere else to go. This was about my grandmother's legacy, a legacy of building, not breaking. My father and brother hadn't just betrayed me. They had betrayed the entire community our family was supposed to serve. They had betrayed the very idea of our name. My resolve, which had been a cold, hard knot of anger, was now on fire. The hardest part was the performance. I had to go to the 42nd floor to pick up some budget reports, a trip I dreaded but knew was necessary. I had to be seen. I had to be seen as me, as weak, emotional, defeated Vicky. I was waiting for the elevator, my head down, when a voice boomed my name. "Vicky, just the person." I turned. Marcus. He was walking toward me, radiating that smug post-victory glow. He looked relaxed, generous, like a king bestowing a favor. He cornered me right there by the elevator bank, in full view of the executive assistants. "Listen, sis," he said, dropping his voice to a tone of sickening fake sympathy. "I know you're upset about the streamlining. I get it. Your projects were like your little babies, right?" He put a hand on my shoulder. I had to physically restrain myself from recoiling. "Look, don't make a scene at the vote next week. It's a done deal. It makes you look emotional, and it makes all of us look bad. Be a team player." I just stared at my shoes, nodding, playing the part of the broken girl. "Okay, Marcus. See? He said, squeezing my shoulder. It's for the best. And hey, we're not monsters. We'll give you a generous severance. Really generous. You can go open a little art gallery or something. Follow your passion, you know. A little art gallery. The condescension was so profound, so suffocating, I could barely breathe. He thought my life's work, a multi-million-dollar foundation, was the equivalent of a hobby he could buy me off from. I had to swallow the bile that rose in my throat. I nodded again, unable to speak. Good girl, he said, patting my shoulder. He gave me a brilliant false smile. Glad we had this talk. He whistled as he walked away toward his corner office. I stood there trembling, my fingernails digging into my palms so hard, I was surprised I wasn't bleeding. The rage was white-hot. It burned away every last vestige of doubt, every last flicker of familial sentiment. He didn't just want to destroy my work. He wanted to pat me on the head while he did it. He hadn't just lit the fuse, he'd handed me the torch. I spent the next 4 days in a blur coordinating with Ben, speaking to no one, living on coffee and adrenaline. Ben, meanwhile, had been doing his own deep dive, locked in his office running numbers. He was furious. He'd been loyal to my grandmother, and he saw what Harrison and Marcus were doing as a personal affront to her memory. He was digging into the merger financials, looking for any leverage, any mistake they'd made. And then he found it. It was 9:00 p.m. on the last night. The night before the vote. I was in my apartment staring at the sealed manila envelope from Abernathy, trying to breathe. My phone buzzed on the table, a secure message from Ben. My heart leaped into my throat. I opened it. It's done. I've triple-checked the SEC filings and the internal accounts. You are officially the majority shareholder and your name is on the ledger. They have no idea. But I found something else. Something better. My fingers trembled as I typed, "What?" The reply came instantly. The legal fees for the Dominion merger. They're astronomical. I couldn't figure out how Marcus was fast-tracking the payments without board approval. Vicky, he's been paying them by pulling from the Heritage Foundation's operational budget. He's been illegally diverting funds. I stopped breathing. The money for the hardwood floors. The money for Maria's rent subsidy. The final text came through. It's not just negligence, it's embezzlement. He's been stealing from you to pay for your own destruction. I have the wire transfer receipts. I have the proof. See you tomorrow, 10 a.m. 42nd floor. My apartment was silent. The adrenaline from Ben's final text had ebbed, leaving behind a vast, hollow quiet that echoed the emptiness in my chest. It was 3:14 a.m. The city outside was a blanket of distant sleeping lights. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., I would either save my grandmother's legacy or I would lose everything. There was no middle ground. I was pacing my stockinged feet, whispering on the hardwood floors, trying to channel the white-hot rage I'd felt earlier. But in the lonely quiet of the night, the rage had cooled, leaving something heavier and more painful in its place. I stopped in front of my bookshelf, my eyes landing on a small silver frame I usually kept turned slightly away. I picked it up. It was from 15 years ago, a lifetime. A day on the lake on my father's boat. I'm 16, all limbs and sunburn, grinning so hard my eyes are squeezed shut. Marcus, his hair bleached by the sun, has his arm slung around my shoulder, pulling me into a mock headlock. He is smiling too, a real unguarded smile, the kind I haven't seen since he started at the company. And at the wheel my father, Harrison Scott. His hand is on the throttle, his face turned toward the camera, and he is laughing. Actually, genuinely laughing. His face is relaxed, the hard, predatory lines I know so well, softened by the sun and the wind. We looked happy. We looked like a family. A real, perfect American dream family, the kind you see in advertisements for life insurance or luxury cars. I sank onto the edge of my sofa, the photograph cold in my hands. A wave of grief so profound and suffocating it stole my breath washed over me. I wasn't just angry at them. I was mourning them. I was mourning the brother who used to protect me, who now saw me as a good girl, to be patted on the head. I was mourning the father whose laugh I used to cherish, who now saw my life's work as dead weight, to be bulldozed. That girl in the photo, the one who believed in her father and brother, she was the one they were truly sacrificing. I finally accepted the truth, a truth that had been hiding in the shadows of my denial for years. The men in that boardroom weren't my family. Not anymore. They were strangers wearing the faces of the people I loved. The people I loved were gone. Maybe they had never existed at all, outside of this one perfect sun-drenched afternoon. Maybe this photograph wasn't a memory. It was a fantasy. And fantasies are a liability. This was the moment, the final painful severing of the emotional cord. Tomorrow wasn't just a business deal. It wasn't just a hostile takeover, even a righteous one. It was an amputation. To save the legacy, I had to cut away the gangrene. I had to kill the fantasy. I had to bury the ghosts of the man who laughed at the wheel and the boy who held me in a headlock. My hand closed around the frame, my knuckles white. A single hot tear slid down my cheek, then another. I let them fall. I grieved for it all, for the family I wished I had, for the love I'd been so desperate to earn. I let the sorrow wash through me, hollow me out and scour me clean. And when the tears stopped, there was nothing left but a vast, cold, and perfect clarity. The last trace of the good girl was gone. I stood up and placed the photo face down on the table. It was time to get ready for war. I walked to my closet and pushed past the clothes I wore for benefits, the soft silks and modest prints. I pushed past the jeans I wore on site. I reached to the very back to the garment bag I'd picked up from the tailor 2 days ago. I laid it on the bed and unzipped it. It wasn't a power suit. It wasn't the sharp-shouldered, high-fashion armor my father's female executives wore, the kind that screamed, "I am a shark." I hated that look. It was a costume. This was a uniform. It was a simple, perfectly tailored sheath dress in a deep dark navy blue. It was made of a heavy wool crepe that didn't wrinkle or cling, but moved with purpose. It had long sleeves, a modest neckline, and a structure as strong and uncompromising as steel. It was the armor of the Heritage Foundation. It was professional. It was understated. It was my identity, not a costume borrowed from theirs. It didn't shout. It didn't have to. It was the color of truth and the cut of resolve. I laid it out on the bed, smoothing the fabric. With it, I placed a pair of simple, low-heeled leather pumps, practical, solid for standing my ground. I added the only jewelry I would wear, my grandmother's watch. It was a simple, elegant steel timepiece, her 25-year service gift from the original Scott & Son community builders. Its ticking was the only sound in the room, steady and relentless. My laptop chimed. 4:00 a.m., our final check-in. I sat at my desk and initiated the secure video call. Ben's face flickered onto the screen. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his eyes red-rimmed, but he was smiling, a grim, tight smile. "You're ready," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm ready," I confirmed. My voice sounded different to my own ears. Lower, steadier. "Good," he said. "The chessboard is set. Cromwell and Swain's legal team is on standby in their conference room. They will be moving the second you give the word. The press release is drafted, the one announcing the merger's rejection, the removal of Harrison and Marcus for cause, and your installment as interim CEO. It's pending your final send command." He held up a thick-bound folder. "And I have the new board appointments, the ones we discussed. Your new board. People loyal to Alara's vision. All they need is your signature to ratify." He paused, his eyes softening for just a second. "This is it, Vicky. This is the moment. They are walking in there blind, arrogant, and so very, very sure they've won." "They've already lost," I said. "They just don't know it yet." All you have to do, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, is walk in there and pull the pin. See you at 10, Ben. I ended the call. The silence rushed back in, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was charged. I showered the hot water, washing away the last of my grief. I dressed the heavy wool of the dress settling on my shoulders like a mantle. I slid my grandmother's watch onto my wrist and fastened the clasp. The click was loud, final. I stood in front of the full-length mirror. The woman looking back was not the good girl. She was not the emotional daughter. Her face was calm, her eyes clear and cold as glacial ice. There was no fear. There was no doubt. There was only purpose. They wanted me to be emotional. They wanted me to be the weeping, sentimental fool they'd always dismissed. They were about to find out what emotional really meant. They were about to learn what happens when you take everything from the person who has been quietly watching, quietly learning, and quietly grieving. They were about to meet Alara Scott's granddaughter. I picked up my briefcase, the one containing Ben's folder of embezzlement proof and Abernathy's manila envelope, my legal ironclad right to rule. I opened my apartment door and walked out into the pre-dawn light, the sky just beginning to bleed from black to a cold, hard gray. The elevator doors slid open on the 42nd floor with a sound like a guillotine sighing. I stepped out onto the polished Italian marble. The air up here was different, pressurized, silent, and smelling overwhelmingly of expensive cologne. It was a sharp chemical lemon scent layered over the faint, musty smell of old leather and older money. It was the smell of power. It was the smell of my father. The boardroom was a glass box, and it was packed. My eyes swept the long 20-foot steel table. Harrison, my father, at the head, looking regal, a lion in winter, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. Marcus at his right, looking like a prince about to be crowned, his face flushed with triumph, his designer suit impeccable. The executive board, their sycophants men like Anderson and Fields, who owed their mortgages to my father, all nodding and smiling, their faces masks of obsequious agreement. And then there were them, the 3 reps from Dominion Holdings. They were exactly as I'd pictured, suits that cost more than my car alligator skin briefcases and the dead patient eyes of well-dressed sharks who'd already smelled the blood in the water. My heels clicked on the marble floor. Click, click, click. The sound was a sharp, jarring intrusion, and every head turned. I saw a flicker of raw annoyance in my father's eyes. Why is she even here but Marcus? Marcus winked at me. He actually physically winked. It was a gesture of such profound, magnanimous, cruel pity that it almost made me falter. "Vicky, sis," he said, his voice booming with a false patronizing warmth that echoed in the sterile room. "Glad you could make it. We're just dotting the I's and crossing the T's. This won't take long." He gestured not to the table but with a flick of his expensive pen to a small, isolated chair set against the wall next to the credenza holding the crystal water service. The kiddie table. It wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate final placement. A message. You are not one of us. You are a spectator to our victory. Be quiet and watch. I said nothing. This was the performance. I kept my face a perfect mask of resigned, sorrowful defeat. I gave a small, broken-looking nod. I walked past the sharks who appraised me with the brief dismissive interest they might give a waitress. I walked past the board members who suddenly found their notepads incredibly fascinating, refusing to meet my eyes. I sat in the chair. It was lower than the ones at the table. I placed my simple, worn briefcase on the floor by my feet. I folded my hands in the lap of my navy blue dress. I was the lamb brought in to witness my own slaughter, and I could see the visible relief on their faces. The emotional daughter, the good girl, wasn't going to make a scene. I kept my expression neutral, my gaze fixed on my folded hands, the perfect picture of the defeated girl. The energy in the room was electric, celebratory. My senses dialed to 11 by adrenaline, and a sleepless night picked up everything. I could hear the clink, clink, clink of ice as a server in a white jacket silently refilled my father's water glass. I could hear the low, confident murmur of the Dominion reps as they reviewed a final document, their voices like gravel stirred with a stick. I could smell the ink from the fresh printed agendas. Harrison stood up, his 6'3" frame commanding the room. He beamed. "All right," he said, his voice, the deep, rich baritone he used for shareholder meetings, the one that exuded effortless control. "Let's bring this historic meeting to order. This is, of course, just a formality. We're all in agreement on the vote to approve the strategic merger with Dominion Holdings." He launched into his speech, a masterpiece of corporate self-congratulation. He talked about maximizing shareholder value. He talked about strategic realignment and aggressive forward thinking. He praised Marcus for his vision and uncompromising leadership in securing a deal that would redefine the Scott legacy for the next century. It was nauseating. He was painting the destruction of his mother's legacy, my grandmother's soul, as its salvation. He was polishing her tombstone and calling it a throne. Then he gestured like a Roman emperor, granting a boon to the head shark. "Mr. Thorne, perhaps a few words on this historic day." Mr. Thorne, the Dominion CEO, stood. He was all smooth charm, tanned skin, and perfectly white teeth. He looked like he'd been assembled by a focus group on what does rich look like. "Thank you, Harrison," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "And may I say, it has been a pleasure negotiating with men who understand the necessity of modern business." His eyes flicked to me for half a second, a flicker of dismissal, then back to Harrison. "We at Dominion are thrilled about this partnership. We see incredible untapped potential in the Scott portfolio." He smiled, and it was all teeth. "Once we optimize it, of course." Optimize, the word he used for gutting. "We believe," Thorne continued, "that by divesting from the non-performing sentiment-driven assets, he meant my life's work, my foundation, the youth center, the lofts, and focusing on high-yield, short-term revenue development, we can unlock the true value Harrison and Marcus have so skillfully brought to the table. We're not just building a company, we're building wealth." The board members nodded enthusiastically. Wealth. That was the only god they prayed to. That was the only word they'd heard. "Excellent, excellent," Harrison said, sitting back down. "Music to my ears." He looked around the table, his gaze skipping right over me as if I were part of the wallpaper. "Then I see no reason to delay. The future is waiting." He clapped his hands together, once a sound as final as a gavel. "We'll now call the formal vote for the approval of the merger. All in favor." He raised his hand high. Marcus raised his hand, a triumphant fist in the air. Their cronies on the board. Anderson Fields, Chen. The ones who owed their careers and their country club memberships to my father all shot their hands up in unison. "That's it then," Harrison declared, beaming at Thorne. The Dominion reps started to clap, a dry, papery sound of skeletons applauding. "With the family and board's 42% of the vote, the motion passes. Welcome to the—" "Mr. Scott." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a shard of ice. Everyone froze. The clapping stopped mid-clap. Harrison's smile twitched, then curdled into a deep, impatient frown. "What is it, Patricia?" Patricia Morrison, our lead corporate attorney, was staring at a document. Her face was the color of old parchment. I had seen the moment it arrived. 15 minutes ago, a stone-faced courier, one I recognized from Cromwell and Swain, had entered the boardroom, walked directly to Patricia, and handed her a single thick, blue-backed legal document. He'd had her sign for it on a digital tablet. She had looked confused, annoyed by the interruption. Then she'd started to read it. I'd watched her out of the corner of my eye as she read it, and reread it, her face draining of all color, her hand beginning to tremble. Patricia, Harrison said again, his tone sharp, furious at the interruption at the breach of his perfect cinematic triumph. What is it? Spit it out. We're celebrating. She looked up. She didn't look at Harrison. She didn't look at Marcus. Her eyes, wide and terrified, flew across the room and found me. They found me in my small, isolated chair by the wall. There was a flicker of something. Awe, fear, dazed, terrifying, understanding. Mr. Scott, she said, her voice trembling but gaining a strange new volume in the dead silent room. I'm afraid there's a discrepancy, a significant discrepancy, in the voting shares. The silence that followed was profound. It was a vacuum. The clink of ice was gone. The murmuring stopped. The only sound was the faint, high-pitched hum of the HVAC system, like a single, sustained scream. Harrison's affable mask dropped completely, revealing the cold, impatient tyrant beneath. What are you talking about, a discrepancy? We hold 42%. It's done. You hold 42% of the minority shares, sir. Patricia said, her voice shaking as she read directly from the document. I have just received certified confirmation from the executors of the Elara Scott Trust. At the mention of his mother, my father's face tightened and Marcus let out an impatient, arrogant sigh. The trust? So what? Marcus snapped, waving his hand dismissively. It's a passive asset. It votes with the board or it's non-voting. We've been over this, Patricia. It's irrelevant. That appears to be incorrect, sir. Patricia stammered, her legal mind clearly reeling as she processed the document in her hand. The trust, per the charter, holds 58% of the company. 58%, Harrison repeated, and for the first time a note of genuine cold uncertainty entered his voice. He looked at Marcus, who just shrugged, still arrogant, still unworried. It doesn't matter, Marcus insisted, his patience gone. Who's the trustee, you, Patricia? We'll have them vote. Get it done. Stop wasting our time. No, sir, Patricia said, shaking her head, her eyes wide. I am not the trustee, and per the charter, the trust, it wasn't passive. It was an inheritance held in custodianship. She was sweating now, reading the lines as if seeing them for the first time. It had 2 vesting conditions. She looked up from the page, her gaze finally locking with my father's. Her face was ashen. The beneficiary's 30th birthday, or, she took a shallow, sharp breath, the initiation of a hostile action against the Scott Heritage Foundation. She let that hang in the air. By filing the merger intent with Dominion, Mr. Scott, she said, her voice barely a whisper, you triggered the early activation clause. The Elara Scott Trust is no longer a trust. As of 10:17 a.m. this morning, those shares, they were transferred in full to the sole beneficiary. Dead. Silence. You could have heard a pin drop on the half-inch thick wool carpet. Harrison's face, which had been ruddy with victory, was now draining of all color, as if someone had pulled a plug in his veins. He went paper white. Who? Marcus demanded, his voice suddenly dangerously low, the arrogance finally fatally cracking, revealing the panic underneath. Who is the beneficiary? Patricia swallowed a small, audible click in the crushing silence. She looked past Harrison. She looked past Marcus. She looked past the stunned, silent board members, past the confused, angry sharks from Dominion, and her gaze landed directly, unequivocally, on me. The sole beneficiary, she announced, her voice ringing with the terrible final clarity of a bell, is Ms. Victoria Scott. If I had pulled a grenade from my briefcase and rolled it down the center of that steel table, the effect could not have been more immediate or more explosive. The silence shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces. What? Mr. Thorne from Dominion roared, shooting to his feet so fast his chair almost toppled over. What the hell is this? What kind of family circus are you running, Harrison? Marcus's face was a grotesque mask of utter profound disbelief. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His smug, confident smile didn't just fade. It shattered like a mirror dropped on concrete, leaving behind something twisted and ugly. My father stood up, but slowly like an old man. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white as bone. That's not possible," he whispered, his voice hoarse, disbelieving. "It's a lie. She wouldn't." She. He meant his mother. He still couldn't fathom it. He couldn't believe his senile mother had outplayed him from the grave. I stood up from my little chair by the wall. The sound of my chair legs scraping the marble floor was deafening. I picked up my briefcase, my grandmother's watch, a cool, steady weight on my wrist. I walked to the table. I walked past the sputtering Dominion reps. I walked right up to the empty space beside Patricia. I set my briefcase down on the gleaming steel, the sound a dull, final thud. I clicked the brass latches open. Click, click. I took out the thick manila envelope from Abernathy and slid it across the polished surface to Patricia. "It's quite possible, Dad," I said. My voice. It didn't shake. It didn't waver. It was calm. It was clear. It was cold. It echoed in the stunned, expensive room. It was not the voice of the good girl. It was not the voice of Vicky Sis. It was the voice of the CEO. All eyes were on me. Marcus, his face now turning a blotchy, mottled red. My father, paper white and trembling, leaning on the table for support. The sharks, their faces dark with fury. The board, their expressions ranging from terror to dawning, greedy comprehension as they realized the power in the room had just shifted like a tectonic plate. They stared at me as if I had just ripped off my face and revealed someone else entirely. "Patricia," I said, my voice cutting through the rising tide of whispers, "I believe you'll find the certified share certificate and the fully executed trust charter in that envelope, courtesy of Cromwell and Swain." Patricia fumbled with the clasp, her hands shaking so badly she almost tore the envelope. She pulled out the thick watermark certificate. Her eyes scanned it, her legal training taking over. She traced the embossed seal. She read the signatory line. She looked at me, her expression one of pure, unadulterated, terrified shock. She nodded, speechless. "She's right, Dad," I said, turning my gaze to him. He looked small. For the first time in my life, my father looked small. "I am the majority shareholder, 58%. I let that hang in the air for a beat. Then I turned my head and looked directly at Mr. Thorne, who was staring at me with a dawning, murderous horror. "And as the majority shareholder, I have concerns." Mr. Thorne's gaze snapped from me to Marcus. His face was no longer charismatic. It was a mask of pure reptilian fury. "This is your family," he hissed, his voice low and threatening, meant only for them. "Handle it." That was the pin. That was the spark. All the blood that had drained from my father's face now flooded into Marcus's. He was a deep, apoplectic, terrifying red. The veins in his neck and temples stood out like thick cords. He finally found his voice, and it wasn't a voice at all. It was a roar. It was the sound of a spoiled king, a preening tyrant realizing his crown was made of paper. He pointed a shaking, accusing finger across the table at me. He pointed at the woman he had dismissed, the sister he had mocked, the good girl he planned to buy off with a little art gallery. "You," he spat the word thick with venom and disbelief. You conniving bitch. What did you do?" I looked at my brother's contorted purple face. The word he spat, bitch, hung in the air, ugly and useless. I didn't even acknowledge it. I didn't acknowledge him. I simply turned my gaze back to Mr. Thorne, the Dominion CEO, who was still standing, his face a mask of thunder, his two partners already looking at their phones, no doubt texting their own legal teams. "My first concern, Mr. Thorne," I said. and my voice was a surprise even to me. It didn't shake. It was the calm, clear, cold voice of command. Is that this merger you're so excited about is built entirely on fraud? That one word fraud sucked the rest of the oxygen from the room. The sputtering stopped. Harrison's head snapped up. Fraud? He repeated, his voice a strangled, papery whisper. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the valuation. I said, my gaze sweeping the stunned faces of the board members. The valuation you all signed off on, based on the packet Marcus prepared. I looked toward the heavy boardroom doors. Ben. On cue, as if he had been waiting for that single word, the doors swung open. Ben Carter walked in. He wasn't the harried, invisible CFO I'd known for years. He stood tall, his spine made of steel, his cheap suit suddenly looking like armor. In his hands, he held a stack of thick spiral-bound folders, a different set from the ones they had. He walked silently, his footsteps the only sound in the vast room, and began placing a folder in front of each board member. He placed one in front of Harrison, who stared at it as if it were a snake. He placed one in front of a stunned, silent Marcus. He slid one down the polished steel table to the apoplectic Dominion reps. You don't need to open them, I said as their hands twitched. I can summarize. My primary concern is that the merger documents, the ones you provided to Dominion, Mr. Thorne, list the Scott Heritage Foundation as a non-performing asset, a liability, a drain on resources valued at its liquidation price, which you've calculated as a negative after demolition costs. It is, Marcus snarled, finally finding his voice a raw, desperate rasp. It's a charity case, you sentimental. Is it? I cut him off, my voice sharp as a scalpel. Ben, tell them. Ben, who had taken his place at my side, looked directly at my father. The Scott Heritage Foundation. He said, his voice clear and damning, ringing with the authority of absolute fact, has turned a 15% net profit year over year for the last 3 years. Its assets are unleveraged. Its revenue stream is consistent, and its community goodwill value, while not on a balance sheet, is the only thing protecting the Scott Global brand from repeated PR disasters. 15%. Anderson, one of the board members, whispered, his greedy fingers already flipping through the folder, his allegiance to my father visibly evaporating. You didn't just overlook that, I said, my voice rising, the ice cracking to reveal the white-hot fire beneath. You hid it. You deliberately and maliciously undervalued my division, my company. I locked eyes with my father. His were wide, uncomprehending. By our calculations, the true market value of the heritage assets combined with their consistent revenue means you undervalued Scott Global Properties by a conservative estimate of $80 million. A collective sucking gasp. The Dominion reps looked like they'd been physically struck. Thorne's face went from angry to a shade of gray I'd never seen. You were about to sell this company, my company. I said, my voice low and dangerous. For $80 million less than it's worth just to get a quick sale and push me out. I don't know what you call that. I let the silence stretch thick and suffocating. I call it gross, willful negligence. Or, I paused, letting the word land with its full devastating weight. More likely, criminal fraud. You don't know what you're talking about, Marcus roared, lurching to his feet, his chair scraping violently. He was completely unhinged, his mask of civility shattered, revealing the panicked, spoiled child beneath. You're a girl playing with crayons. Those numbers are lies. You made them up. Are they? I asked, my voice soft again, deadly. I also know why you were in such a hurry to push this through, Marcus. I know why you were willing to take such a lowball offer from Mr. Thorne. I nodded to Ben. Ben, if you would. Ben clicked a small remote in his hand. The massive wall screen at the end of the boardroom, the one Marcus had used for his triumphant presentation less than an hour ago, flickered to life. It wasn't a pie chart, it was a bank statement. "What is this?" Harrison demanded, squinting. "That I said, is the Heritage Foundation's primary operational budget account. And those, I said as Ben clicked to the next slide, are the wire transfers. 4 of them all in the last 10 days, totaling $1.2 million. Ben clicked again. The slide zoomed in, magnifying a single line of text, a digital authorization for the transfer. "That," I said, my voice vibrating with a rage so cold it burned, "is the signature of Marcus Scott, authorizing the transfer of $1.2 million out of my foundation's accounts and into the merger legal and escrow account." The room went utterly catastrophically silent. Marcus's face, he looked like he couldn't breathe. He was white, his mouth open, his eyes bulging as he stared at his own signature blown up 10 feet high. He was caught, utterly, irrevocably caught. "You were in such a hurry," I whispered, but the words carried across the room, each one a hammer blow, "because you were paying the astronomical legal fees and retainers for this fraudulent deal by embezzling the money from me." I took a step toward him, my hands clenched at my sides. "You were stealing from the youth center's construction fund. You were stealing from the artist subsidies at the mill. You were making me pay for my own execution." "Victoria!" My father's voice was a cannon blast. He slammed both fists on the table, and the crystal water glasses jumped ice rattling. His face was a deep, terrifying purple, the veins in his thick neck bulging. "Stop this! This is family. You will not do this. This is my company. I built it. Family." I spat the word. It tasted like poison, like ash. I turned on him all the years of pain, of dismissal, of being the emotional disappointment, of swallowing my grief, coalescing into this one final white-hot moment. Family. Where was family when you and Marcus stood here an hour ago, laughing about bulldozing my life's work? Where was family when you approved the documents that valued my company at 80 million less than it's worth? Where was family when he, I pointed a shaking finger at Marcus, who was now slowly sinking into his chair, a man utterly visibly broken, was stealing from my accounts to fund your deal? I walked right up to the head of the table until I was staring my father down eye to eye, close enough to see the sudden dawning fear in his. He flinched. For the first time in my life, Harrison Scott flinched before me. "You patted me on the head," I said, my voice low and trembling with a decade of suppressed fury. "You told me not to be emotional. You told me to go run a little art gallery, while you gave my inheritance, my grandmother's legacy, to these vultures." My voice broke, but not with weakness, with rage. You stopped being my family when you decided my soul was for sale." I straightened my back, feeling the full crushing, liberating weight of my 58% settle onto my shoulders like a steel mantle. "You wanted me to be a Scot. You wanted me to have a killer instinct. Fine. Here I am." I turned from my father's stunned, defeated face. I looked back at the Dominion reps who were already packing their briefcases, their faces like stone. They knew. The deal wasn't just dead, it was toxic. As the 58% majority shareholder of Scott Global Properties, I announced, my voice ringing out final and absolute, "I vote no on the merger." I looked at Patricia, the attorney, who was just staring, mesmerized, her own folder forgotten. "The motion is defeated. The deal is dead." "You'll hear from our lawyers," Thorne roared, snapping his briefcase shut. It was a pathetic, reflexive threat. "Get in line," I said, not even looking at him. "And now," I raised my voice, "get out of my boardroom." It was not a request. It was an execution. Thorne looked like he wanted to say something else, to posture, to threaten, but one of his own men, a younger, smarter shark, put a hand on his arm and pulled him toward the door. They left a stampede of rage and expensive leather. The boardroom doors thudded shut, leaving us. Leaving family. The silence that fell was different. It wasn't stunned. It was a vacuum. It was the silence of a tomb, the silence after the bomb has gone off. My father, Harrison Scott, the lion, the patriarch, the titan of industry, he didn't just sit, he slumped. He collapsed into his high-backed leather chair as if his strings had been cut, his bones turned to dust. He looked old, he looked small, he looked finished. Marcus was making a sound, a high-pitched gulping wheezing sound. He was hyperventilating his $5,000 suit jacket drenched in sweat, his eyes wide and vacant with shock. He was a child who had been caught, truly caught for the first time in his life. I let the silence sit for a full 10 seconds. I let them suffocate in it. "Well," I said, turning to the stunned, silent board members, who were frozen in a state of terrified awe. That was unpleasant, but necessary. I smoothed the front of my navy blue dress. "Now, for the new order of business." I walked back to my briefcase and pulled out Ben's final folder, the one with the new resolutions. "Effective immediately." I said, my voice devoid of all emotion, a clean, sharp instrument. "I am exercising my authority as majority shareholder, and by proxy the majority of this board." I looked at my father's slumped form. "Harrison Scott is removed as chairman of the board for gross mismanagement, shareholder value destruction, and conspiracy to commit corporate fraud." He didn't even look up. He just stared at the polished steel of the table, a broken statue. "Effective immediately." I continued, turning my gaze to my wheezing, gasping brother. "Marcus Scott is removed as CEO for gross mismanagement, criminal embezzlement, and, well, for cause." I looked at the board members who were frozen in terror, not knowing who was next. "Ben Carter," I said, gesturing to the man beside me, "is hereby appointed interim CFO effective immediately. He will oversee the transition and a full independent audit." "Security!" I called out, my voice not loud, but carrying to the door. As if they had been summoned, the two heavy boardroom doors swung open again. But it wasn't the Dominion reps. It was two uniformed armed security guards. They were big men. I did not recognize. Men Ben must have hired from an outside firm. Men who had no loyalty to my father, no history with my brother. They stepped just inside the room, their hands clasped their faces, impassive. "These gentlemen," I said, "will escort you from the building. You will be allowed to collect your personal effects from your offices under supervision. Your corporate accounts, your key cards, and all access codes have already been deactivated." The finality of it, the deactivation. That was the word that broke Marcus. The hyperventilating stopped, and it was replaced by a sound of pure animalistic rage. "No!" he screamed, his voice cracking, pitching high. He lunged, not at me. He lunged for the table, for the folders, for something. It was a desperate, chaotic, childish tantrum. "You can't! This is mine! Mine!" He didn't get 2 steps. The security guards were on him, professionals, one taking each arm in a clean, practiced neutralizing hold. They lifted him, his feet kicking, and he started screaming, all pretense of the corporate prince gone, replaced by the spoiled, cornered animal. "You'll never run this company!" He shrieked, his face a mask of spittle and tears, his neck corded. "You're nothing. You're a soft stupid. Bitch, you'll run it into the ground. Dad, do something." I didn't even flinch. I didn't wince. I watched them drag my brother, my childhood protector, the boy, from the boat, screaming and kicking from the room. I watched the monster he had become. The doors closed. The screaming was muffled, then gone. Dead silence. Only my father remained. He was still slumped in his chair. He hadn't moved. He hadn't said a word. He just stared at the table. I looked at him. The man who had laughed in the sun. The man who had called me a disappointment. The man who had just tried to sell my soul for parts. The grief I'd felt last night, the girl in the photograph, it was all gone, burned away. There was nothing left. No anger, no sorrow, just emptiness. A vast, cold, necessary emptiness. "You," I said to him, my voice flat, "you have 1 hour." I turned my back on him. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family on the stunned board on the entire 42nd floor. I picked up my simple briefcase, the one that held my power. I looked at Ben. He was pale, but his eyes were shining. He nodded once. I walked to the doors. I pushed them open and walked out, leaving the ruin behind me. The click of my heels on the marble floor was the only sound. I didn't go back to the boardroom. I went to the CEO's office. My office. It was vast, cold, and felt as impersonal as a museum hanger. The air was stale, thick with the smell of my father's expensive cigars, a scent that had always made my stomach turn. It was the smell of backroom deals and casual cruelty. The entire back wall was a single plate of glass, a billionaire's view of the city, and I stood at it, my arms crossed, watching. 42 floors below, so small they looked like ants. I saw them. 2 security guards were flanking Marcus, who was still struggling, his suit jacket twisted. He looked pathetic. A few seconds later, my father walked out. He didn't struggle. He just stopped on the sidewalk, a man completely adrift, and stared up at the tower he had built. He stared up at me. Then a car I didn't recognize pulled up and he got in, disappearing into the city's anonymous traffic. They were gone. The second they were out of sight, the adrenaline that had been holding me up, the white-hot rage that had been my fuel, evaporated. It didn't fade. It vanished like a floor dropping out from under me. My knees buckled. I stumbled back, my legs suddenly made of sand, and fell into the enormous high-backed leather chair behind the massive desk. His chair. It was still warm. The sheer, crushing weight of what I had just done slammed into me. I hadn't just won a company. I had destroyed my family. I had taken a metaphorical knife and carved my father and brother out of my life and out of the company they loved more than me, more than anything. This was the cost. This was the victory. It was necessary. It was righteous. It was just, and it tasted like ash. I put my head in my hands, the smell of cigar smoke and old leather filling my nose, and for one long agonizing moment, I just wanted to weep. I wanted to be the good girl, again, the one who didn't have to make this choice, the one whose family didn't need to be amputated. A soft knock. The door opened. It was Ben, his face pale but his eyes clear. He was holding a simple white ceramic mug. "I figured you could use this," he said quietly, placing the coffee on the vast, empty desk. It looked tiny, a small human object in a land of giants. "It's done. They're gone. Security confirmed they're off the property. The board is re-evaluating their positions. They'll fall in line." I took the mug. The coffee was black, scalding hot. The pain of it burning my tongue was a welcome, grounding sensation. "Thank you, Ben." He stood there awkwardly for a moment, a man who had lived his whole life in the background, suddenly in the epicenter. "Congratulations, my boss." That one word, boss, snapped me back into focus. The grief would come. It would come tonight and probably tomorrow and in waves for years. But it couldn't come now. Now I had a company to save. I took another sip, the caffeine a jolt to my system. I stood up the chair, feeling too big, too cold. "Get an all-hands meeting on the books, Ben, right now, in the main atrium. I want every employee who's in this building." "Right now?" he asked, surprised. "Vicky, maybe you should take an hour just to—" "No, not an hour," I said, my voice hard again. They just saw the CEO and the chairman escorted out by security. They're terrified. They're updating their resumes. The Dominion merger is dead, but they don't know that. They think the sharks are still circling. We can't let that fear fester. We cut it out. Now, get it done. He saw the steel return to my eyes and just nodded. "Yes, ma'am. 5 minutes." I walked out of the sterile, cigar-stained office, leaving the too big chair and the billion-dollar view behind. I took the glass elevator down, not to the executive garage, but to the main floor. The atrium was a 3-story marble expanse, and it was already filling up. The digital whispers of the corporate world were faster than any memo. They came from every department: accounting, marketing, legal, admin, the mailroom. A sea of hundreds of employees all gathered their faces, a mix of confusion, terror, and morbid curiosity. They looked like a herd of animals who had just smelled a predator. Ben handed me a microphone, his hand shaking slightly. I stepped up onto the low platform by the main reception desk. The murmuring died. There was only the sound of the air conditioning. I looked out at their faces. These were the people my father and brother had dismissed as dead weight. The people whose lives were just numbers on a balance sheet. "Hi," I said. My voice echoed too loud. I lowered it. "Most of you don't know me. You know my name, but you've seen me in the Heritage Wing or in the cafeteria." I took a deep breath. "My name is Victoria Scott. As of an hour ago, there was a vote. The strategic merger with Dominion Holdings has been rejected." A sound rippled through the crowd. A gasp. A collective sigh of relief so loud it was almost a roar. "That deal is dead," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "Which means the rumors of liquidation are false. Your jobs are safe." A smattering of applause broke out, hesitant, then stronger. "There have been some significant leadership changes." I said, the understatement of the century. "Effective immediately, Harrison and Marcus Scott are no longer with this company." Dead silence again. Shock. This was the part they feared. The unknown. "As of today," I said, my voice ringing out clear and steady, "I am the new chief executive officer of this company." I let that land. I looked out at them, at Maria's friends, at Jamal's colleagues. And that means things are going to change. For a long time, the Heritage Foundation has been seen as a side project, a soft division. As of today, that side project is the new core of this company. We are done building things that just make money. We are going to build things that last. We are going to build a company that this city is proud to have. We're going to build better. I paused. "This won't be easy, but we are done with the old way of doing things. Go back to your desks. The merger is off. The company is secure. We have work to do." For a second, nobody moved. Then one person in the front, someone from my own division, started clapping. Then Ben started. Then, like a wave, it broke. A slow, then thunderous, then overwhelming round of applause. It wasn't just applause. It was relief. It was hope. I nodded, handed the mic back to Ben, and walked through the crowd who parted for me, their faces no longer terrified, but full of a dawning, fragile hope. I got back to the elevator, my hands shaking. The adrenaline was gone, and I was just tired. Tired to my bones. As the doors closed, sealing me in the glass box, my phone rang. It wasn't a text. It was a call. The caller ID made my stomach clench. "Mom." I almost didn't answer. I let it ring, once, twice, once. Then I hit accept, but said nothing. For a moment there was just silence. Then a sound, a hitching, broken sound. She was weeping. "Victoria," she choked out. "I'm here, Mom." "How could you?" She whispered, her voice a raw wound. "How could you do this to us? Your father, your brother, they're ruined. You've ruined us. You've ruined this family." I closed my eyes. The elevator doors opened to the empty, silent 42nd floor. The smell of cigars hit me again. I looked at the nameplate on the wall, Harrison Scott, Chairman. It was already a relic. "No, Mom." I said, my voice so quiet I could barely hear myself, but it was steady. It was the steadiest thing left in my world. "They ruined themselves." I pressed the red end call button and hung up on my mother. 6 months. That's how long it's been since I walked out of that boardroom, leaving the wreckage of my family behind. The 42nd floor doesn't smell like stale cigar smoke and fear anymore. It smells like fresh paint, sawdust, and strong coffee. The first thing I did was get rid of the tomb. I had the dark, oppressive mahogany paneling ripped out, along with the half-ton steel desk that looked more like a bunker than a piece of furniture. Now the walls are all glass or clean, bright white. The floors are a light-polished maple, Where my father's imposing desk used to be, there is a massive communal drafting table currently covered in blueprints and material samples. This isn't an office designed to intimidate, it's a workshop designed to build. The only thing on the main wall is a simple brushed aluminum sign. It doesn't say Scott Global Properties, it says Scott Community Builders. The name change was the last piece to fall into place. The legal battles were, as Alara's lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, had grimly predicted, short and brutal. Dominion Holdings sued, of course, screaming breach of contract and demanding astronomical damages. My father and brother sued, scraping together what allies they had left to contest Alara's trust, claiming undue influence, that she was senile, that I was incompetent. They threw every high-priced shark they could find at me, and they lost. They lost spectacularly. My grandmother's trust was an ironclad fortress of legal genius. Abernathy and his team didn't just defend, they countersued for the $1.2 million Marcus had embezzled and for the civil fraud inherent in the undervalued merger. The fallout was total. The board members who didn't resign in shame immediately after the meeting were voted out at an emergency shareholder meeting 2 days later. My father and brother facing a criminal investigation for embezzlement and a slew of civil suits settled. They gave up any remaining claims, any stock options, any right to the Scott name. They are gone. Not just from the company, but from the city. They are social and financial pariahs, the men who tried to gut their own family legacy and in a spectacular blaze of arrogance got caught. They are ghosts. I thought they would haunt me. I thought I'd see my father's face in the empty chair or hear my brother's screams in the elevator. But I don't. I'm not haunted. I'm too busy. The company is thriving. We're leaner, yes, but we're healthier. We're profitable. It turns out sentiment has real bankable value. The zoning committee approved the sustainable materials for the Rivertown expansion, Ben Carter says, looking up from an iPad. He's not the interim CFO anymore. He's just the CFO. And he looks 10 years younger, the perpetual worry lines around his eyes finally smoothed out. He's sitting across from me at the drafting table, not 10 feet away at the end of a steel slab. I tap the blueprint in front of us. Good. That means the solar panel integration gives us the tax credit we need to keep the rents in the low-income units stable for the next decade. It's a profitable low-income housing project, Ben says, a note of lingering awe in his voice. He's run the numbers a dozen times, still not quite believing it. Your father always said that was impossible, that it was a choice between charity and profit. My father thought profit only came from cutting corners. I reply, picking up a blue pencil to make a notation on the electrical plan. He forgot you can also find it by building smarter, by building better. Build better. It's our new motto. It's painted in the lobby, it's on our letterhead, and it's the core of our new strategy. The soft approach, as Marcus called it, is working. We're respected. We're in control. We're building the company Alara always wanted, the one she'd originally named Scott & Son Community Builders, all those years ago. I just brought her vision home. Ben rolls up the blueprints. I'll get these to the architects. You have that interview with the Times at 2. Thanks, Ben. He nods, and for the first time in his life, he looks truly, deeply content. He leaves, and I'm alone in the bright, quiet space. I walk to the vast window, the same view my father had, the city sprawling out to the horizon, but I'm not looking at the skyline as a collection of assets to be bought and sold. I'm looking at the neighborhoods. From here, I can just see the new crane over the north side, where the youth center's new gymnasium is finally being built. I can see the roof of the Rivertown Mill, where Maria Rodriguez is probably painting her rent secure. I'm not haunted. I'm not grieving. I'm free. I think back to that day 6 months ago, to that boardroom filled with arrogant, powerful men, their faces flushed with a victory they thought was already theirs. My father and brother made one catastrophic, fatal mistake. They looked at that gleaming steel table and saw only sharks, wolves, and sheep. They thought the most dangerous thing in that room was the man with the biggest bank account, or the one at the head of the table who screamed the loudest. They never realized, not for 1 second, until it was far, far too late, that the most dangerous person in that room was the one they'd already dismissed. The one they had insulted, mocked, and pushed into the corner. The emotional one. The quiet one. The one who had absolutely nothing left to lose, and a whole community to fight for. As Victoria looked out over her city, she was finally free, having rebuilt her legacy from the ashes of betrayal. What did you think of Victoria's incredible transformation? Let us know in the comments. We genuinely read all of your thoughts. Subscribe for more stories of justice and new beginnings. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.